Things that Christians aren't ready to hear, part 5. That Paul's teaching directly contradicts the teachings of Jesus.
I've been seeing this idea float around the internet lately, and it's time to address it. Let's check it out.
Jesus says in Matthew 5, I did not come to abolish the law. Paul in both Romans and Galatians tells people you are not under the law.
So he starts off by quoting Jesus in Matthew 5, but only half of the verse, that he came not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them, which is what Jesus does. He fulfills the prophecies of being the Messiah, and he obeys the law perfectly and actually does away with the sacrificial system for sin as being the great sacrifice on behalf of us for our sin. Paul in Romans 7 actually affirms that the law is good. And of course, Paul points out that because of Jesus, we're now freed from the law. But he actually uses the same language in saying that the law is fulfilled in what? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Because we're no longer under the burden of having to keep the law, but are under grace, we get to go now fulfill the law in its true purpose, not to try to earn righteousness with God, but simply to love God and love others.
Jesus says you'll be judged on how you treat the poor, the sick, the imprisoned. That's Matthew 25. Paul says that you're saved by faith alone, not works.
There are a few things to point out here. The first is that in the very next chapter, Jesus clearly views his death as a sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. The second, and I think a lot of Christians forget this, Paul does not negate the idea that Christians also won't be judged. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. So in some sense, there is judgment for Christians. There's just not condemnation because Jesus poured out his blood for the forgiveness of our sins. And there's a subtle nuance in Matthew 25 in the story where the righteous look at Jesus and go, hey, when did we do all of these righteous things for you? Because they're not doing these righteous acts and bringing them before God like, look at all the great things we did. They simply did it because they followed Jesus, and in loving the least of these, they loved him. Because as Paul points out in Ephesians 2, even though salvation is by grace through faith, Christians still do good works. This is just like some basic Bible hermeneutics.
Jesus empowers women. He lets them learn and lead. Paul, or someone writing in his name, says, I do not permit a woman to teach.
This opens up a whole nother conversation about the role of women in the church and Paul's writing in 1 Timothy that I think needs some context. But I will say this. To quote Rebecca McLaughlin, Christianity is the greatest movement of women and for women, period, of all movements in the history of the world.
Modern Christianity isn't based on the teachings of Jesus. It's based on the theology of Paul.
Those are the same thing, because Paul's an apostle of Christ who the other apostles affirmed and spread the gospel to the Gentiles. There's no contradiction between Jesus and Paul.